Everyone, I think, knows the basic rule of dinner parties, no talking about politics or religion. But only slightly less well known is the secondary rule, which is if you are going to talk about religion, definitely do not talk about two of the things that religion often talks about. Let's call it the hanky-panky and money. And of the two, I think money might be the more difficult one to talk about. So it's a good thing that our church handles uncomfortable situations very well, because we're talking about money for 3 whole weeks as we go through this generosity series. One of the reasons, admittedly, it is tricky to talk about money in church and as a pastor is because churches have not and do not always handle money well. You are a Google search away from endless stories about televangelists preying on poor people and pastors with far too expensive shoes and houses with too many tennis courts. And on the other end of things, even for churches trying to use money faithfully, it's easy to look at money as only a tool for our own survival, a necessary evil to keep the lights on. And when we get in survival mode, we tend to become fearful. And when we get fearful, we can pressure people to give more than they're able to, forgetting that our purpose is to serve others, not just keep the lights on. Although we do want to keep the lights on, and we need money for it. It's important for us to talk about money, though, because our religion, our faith in God and Jesus has claims for our values and how we live our lives. Money is literally a mediator of value, and so it's a way for us to practice our values in our lives. Our faith has very clear claims on our values: love God, love neighbor, and so we should use money to do it. My hope for today is we leave here open to a wider understanding of generosity than we came with. An understanding that we see in one of my favorite verses in Scripture, even if it sounds like some dusty old laws. I'd never come across this passage until our Old Testament professor in seminary pointed it out to us, and it changed how I thought about tithing. This verse comes from the book of Deuteronomy, a book finished during a very turbulent time in Israel's history. Jerusalem was in ruins, the nation destroyed, the people taken away in exile to Babylon. And in exile, the Israelites started to reevaluate their history and imagine a better future. As part of that work, a group of scribes produced this book. They looked at the writings of the prophets who had warned the nation they were falling from God's ways. The prophets held up the resident aliens, immigrants, orphans, and widows as barometers of justice. If the nation was living up to who God called them to be, then the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow would be blessed. They would be taken care of by everyone else. But if the nation was not loving God and neighbor, it would be clear in the conditions in which the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow found themselves. The warning of the prophets was that those people on the margins were not living well. The nation was not loving God or neighbor. As a consequence, the nation collapsed and went into exile. And this was a radically new view. The dominant idea at the time was that when two nations were in conflict and went to war, the gods up above were warring, and the stronger God would win. And the prophets were offering a new and different perspective, that God, their God, is sovereign over everything, and God hadn't been defeated. God allowed the people to experience the consequences of rejecting God. And now God was offering them grace again to get back on their feet and have a second chance. So the scribes working on Deuteronomy looked to one of the few kings who heeded the prophets, the reformer Josiah. They took the book of the law that was discovered or written during his reign, and around it they crafted a new, what can almost be described as a constitution in the book of Deuteronomy, a new imagining of what the nation could be at its best as it pursued God with everything it had. And they framed the book as Moses' final sermon, a second law giving for the hope of their new nation. Deuteronomy means second law giving. As they worked this question of justice, of how to treat the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow in light of God's will was central to the work. So they faced the question in our hope for who we can be at our best. What should we do with our money? How should we use it? What does God want us to do with our money? We've been asking that same question ever since, and certainly we have found a variety of answers. Some people, like St. Francis, became ascetics or took vows of poverty, staying away from money as much as possible to avoid falling to any corruption. Others, like the founder of the Methodist movement, John Wesley, saw money more as a tool, something that you could use. He gave Methodists the instructions, make all you can so that you can save all you can, so that you can give all you can. Wesley was concerned that Methodists were ignoring the third part because he was convinced if people were generous and gave all they could, much of the world's ills would fall away. That critique never went away, but we in America and American culture largely brushed it off. Here the answer was simple: greed is good. Accumulate as much money as possible and never stop. American culture lifted up captains of industry as role models, but they got another name as well: robber barons. Cornelius Vanderbilt and his railroads, J.D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil's monopolistic practices, Andrew Carnegie, who President Theodore Roosevelt called one who makes a god of mere money-making. They did usher in technological improvements and donate vast sums of money that improved their public image, but they also left plenty of people trampled in their wake. In my teenage years, I was being taught about a new crop of wealthy people to idolize: Jeff Bezos. Look how he went from innovating on bookstores to what Amazon is today. I lost an earbud a couple weeks ago, and a new one was in my mailbox the same day I ordered a replacement. Progress and innovation. And along the way, reports of workers forced to relieve themselves on the job to keep up with demands. Small businesses brought into Amazon's marketplace and then undercut by Amazon's own cheaper version of their product. A burgeoning scandal and Audible platform for mistreating and misleading authors. Mark Zuckerberg, who we were being shoved onto Facebook and told, this is how you can connect with people, promising to connect everyone to far-flung friends and family. Yet Facebook and Instagram allegedly knew about the harmful effects of their platforms on young girls. Zuckerberg allegedly censored on behalf of the Chinese government, and according to the UN's independent fact-finding mission on Myanmar, stated that Facebook played a determining role in the Rohingya genocide carried out by the Myanmar armed forces. None of us approach that level of greed and accumulation of wealth, but the effects of a culture that lifts them up trickles down to us all. There's a temptation to cut ethical corners in pursuit of wealth. There's always pressure to keep up with the Joneses, to get the nicer car, the bigger house, the fancier boat. I wonder how much people would give if there wasn't a tax incentive. Which, to be clear, I'm very grateful there is a tax incentive. But the fact that we thought there was a need to incentivize charitable giving points to a larger truth. We struggle with generosity. The people working on Deuteronomy knew this. They believed generosity toward one another, especially the poor and people on the margins of society like the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow. Generosity towards those people was essential for being God's people. Failing to do so was part of what went wrong and landed them in exile. They heard God calling them to reimagine their way of doing life. And so they drew on what their past reformers wrote, and they gave us our text for today. It sits at the beginning of a section in the book elaborating on the command to keep the Sabbath holy. So it might seem a little strange to start off talking about money. The Sabbath was a day of rest. Why don't we start off talking about resting? That sounds a lot more fun. What does the Sabbath have to do with money? The Sabbath wasn't just a day off. The Sabbath is the foundation for many of the laws in this section. The Sabbath shaped the people's relationship to God because it was a recognition of God's sovereignty. It was an acknowledgement that the created order of the world existed, that God made the world a certain way, and our place in it, the time that we have in it, is a gift from God. To surrender a day to God was an acknowledgement that all the time we have is a gift. And to surrender a day to God was a blessing because God offered them rest and the renewal of life on that day. Keeping the Sabbath holy means we acknowledge the goodness in the created order of the world as gifts from God. God has gifted us day to do good and night to sleep. God has gifted us seasons to plant and seasons to harvest. God has gifted us all the days of our life. And so the beginning of generosity for the authors of Deuteronomy was not a tax incentive. Generosity arose when we recognized God's sovereignty and all of the gifts that God has given us. Although generosity in this text might look a little different than how we're used to talking about it. This text talks about tithing. And I usually hear tithing talked about in this way. A tithe means a tenth. Tithing is taking 10% of your income for a year and giving it to God. Only since we can't give things directly to God, we give it to places that exist to serve others, like churches and charities. But this is what Deuteronomy says here. Imagine you're an Israelite farmer. You've worked hard all through the year. Each time you had any grain or wine or oil and the firstlings of your herd, you set aside a tenth of it for God. Now it's time to tithe. So you get to go on an exciting journey. Go somewhere really cool, the place that God has established God's presence, and you're going to take all that stuff or whatever you want to buy with the cash that you got from selling it, and you're going to give it to the pastor. No, that's not what it says. It doesn't say you go and give it to the priest or you go and burn it up in an altar. It says you go take it, you sit where God is, and you eat. You shall eat all of that stuff in God's presence. Giving all of this to God is a celebration. And as a proud teetotaler, I am shocked and offended, not really, that it even, I am a teetotaler, I'm not actually shocked and offended, that it even explicitly says you can buy strong drink and drink all of it. I looked up the median household income in Frisco. This would be equivalent to someone here taking out $14,500 on a single party. I tried Googling what to do with that. Google couldn't come up with an answer. Deuteronomy says you should be extremely generous in your celebrations, still in response to God's gift, but you take 10% of your income and celebrate with it. That's not normally how I hear about tithing. Deuteronomy says the generosity we have in response to God should overflow to every part of our lives, even our celebrations. We should be generous in everything we do. Now, some disclaimers. I think giving 10% to the church is a wonderful goal. I know not everyone can get there, but I think it's great and worthwhile and spiritually rewarding. It's what Aubrey and I have been doing as long as we have had an income to give, and it's helped our spiritual growth. And before you spend whatever you plan on donating on a joyride to Vegas, there is more that Deuteronomy says. Be generous in your celebrations, tithe your celebrations even, but what about the Levite, the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows? What about the poor, the people who can't make enough to tithe with? Every third year, you give your tithe to them, so that they may come and eat their fill. I'm afraid I can't always give the scribes working on Deuteronomy credit for coming up with practical solutions. For example, what are these people supposed to do the other 2 of the 3 years? But the aims of Deuteronomy are often some of the best expressions of love in the Bible. Here the authors call people not to give 10%, not to give 5%, not to grow their tithing. The expectation they set is that people recognize what they have as a gift from God. And they are so moved by God's grace Their generosity grows so great that the Levites, the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows don't get enough to get by. They eat until they are full. The vision of people living in the light of God's love is that every single person can be full because of the generosity of their neighbors. It can be hard to find people living like that. They exist, though. I know they exist in our church, where your generous giving in response to God's work has placed us here as we work to discover how to best love our neighbors. And I saw another example in an unlikely place in my YouTube subscriptions this week. I've been following Hank and John Green in some form since I was in high school, and I noticed that the young people and a couple of others are the only ones nodding. If you don't know who they are, I promise you, your grandkids or kids or nieces or nephews can tell you all about them. As I understand it, it all started with the brothers wanting to talk more. So they decided to record videos each day and post them on a relatively new website you may have heard of called YouTube. The brothers alternated days and created the Vlogbrothers YouTube channel. But that's not how most of the people I knew in high school had heard of them. John Green is an author, and the success of the YouTube channel catapulted his career as a fiction author, especially breaking through with the success of The Fault in Our Stars, which you may have seen or read. With that wild success, for John came worsening mental health issues. But he turned that crisis into an opportunity to share, to encourage others, to include more mental health struggles in his books for readers to identify with and grow with. John eventually turned to nonfiction, writing most recently Everything is Tuberculosis, becoming an advocate to eradicate a disease we should have long since cured and have not, as I understand in his claim, because it hasn't been profitable enough to defeat. But thanks to his work, there's been marked improvement. But that's not actually how I heard about them. I heard about them through a different thing on YouTube people in my generation are also very familiar with, Crash Course. The brothers decided to leverage their celebrity and expertise to create educational videos to help students in high school AP classes studying for college credit. Crash Course videos are now one of the most widely used teaching tools in the country. And when they saw the funding for Crash Course was about to run out, they created a more ethical funding model. And they didn't keep it for themselves. They shared their new platform with others. More recently, out of Crash Course came Study Hall, an attempt to create an affordable path to higher education, where people can take college classes without having to pay for them until they are ready to claim the credit. Crash Course wasn't even the only educational channel they launched. The brothers also realized, as all of these different people started making videos and things separate from each other, that it could be really lonely. And so they said, great, let's bring people together. They started the first conference for people making digital videos to try and build a better community. They created a nonprofit agency to represent the creators in different negotiations. They started a sock subscription company with the socks designed by independent artists and all of the profits donated to Partners in Health, a group working for health around the world, and from which they contributed a third of the cost to build the Maternal Center for Excellence in Sierra Leone to combat maternal mortality. They started a free coffee company with the same business model, eventually combined them into Good Store, which has donated $10 million. Hank Green, also a musician, got cancer, and then he turned his experience with cancer into a comedy special to lift people up and lighten things for other people going through similar experiences. And there's a bunch more, but I should probably wrap up the sermon soon. At every opportunity, these brothers took whatever they had, success or failure, and turned it outward for the benefit of others. I'm sure they've made plenty of money, but when they had the chance to make more, they consistently did what they always do. They leveraged their success into helping others. They were generous. I doubt anyone here will ever be as visibly successful as them. Although, if anyone has $10 million, again, we're always willing to accept millions of dollars. But everyone here can be as generous. Recognizing the gifts we have been given and offering everything we have, our celebrations, our money, and our love from God, not for the church, but for the love of our neighbors. May we do so. Amen.